Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Shujat Ahmadzadeh. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar called the 12 billion question. Can the EU anchor itself in Central Asia? Organized by the Topchubashov Center. And in today's webinar, we'll be discussing one of the most strategically significant developments shaping the future of Central Eurasian heartland. That is about the growing role of Middle Corridor and how it intersects with evolving partnership of Central Asian countries with the EU, with Russia, and China. In this webinar, I'm joined by two esteemed experts. One is Yunis Sharifli, who is a non-resident fellow of the China Global South Project, and also Mohammad Mamadov, who is a research fellow at the Topchubashov Center. In today's session and today's webinar, we'll be focusing on a very important region that is home to almost 80 million people, that has grew significantly over the past years because of largely the war in Ukraine and also its importance to global connectivity projects run by China and also EU at the same time. Today we'll be discussing EU Central Asia cooperation, Middle Corridor challenges, and also in the future whether Central Asia could act as a one unified polity in the multipolar international order. Without taking too much time, I want to start this webinar with asking perhaps the introductory and a bit sort of ambiguous question of where where does Central Asia stand, specifically in terms of increasing multipolar international relation system with a specific focus on Central Asian interaction with the EU. So how does one region that is home to 80 million people, that consists of five countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, and perhaps some also would add Afghanistan here, is perceived internationally, and more importantly, in the EU? I want to start with Eunice, if that order would work.
So thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for Topchubashov Center to invitation. So that's a great question, actually, I think, for starting. And traditional Central Asia known for its vast resource of the energy resource, particularly oil and gas. But particularly, we saw that there's a changing perception toward the region, because when we look to 1990s and 2000s, the Western countries looked the region particularly for diversify their the partnership for energy import. But I would say that there's a lack of engagement because of the Russian primacy in the post-Soviet region. However, we saw that there's a changing perception toward the region due to the several factors, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war start to change region's importance, particularly for Western countries, but also for the China. And we saw that actually three factors currently is very important. The first, the transportation route, we call it Middle Corridor, because as you know, after the Russia-Ukraine war the Middle Corridor start to increase its importance for both China and the European Union as an alternative or complementary route for the European Union and for reducing dependency on Russia as a transit country. The second most important things about regional countries growing program on the renewable energy, and this region also create new market for both Chinese companies and European Union companies. And we saw that European Union companies see the region as a new export market for the renewable energy technologies. And finally, and most importantly, currently, the most trending topic, it's about critical minerals. The critical minerals we saw cobalt, copper, tungsten, and plus rare earth materials and rare earth minerals. And we saw that Central Asia has an untapped reserve in the region. So in the current international situation, when we look of Russia-Ukraine war, the confrontation between China and the United States, we saw that particular critical minerals attract all regional and global power attention, and they try to access the resource, extract, and relatively process and import it. And from my point of view, in the currently, these three factors play important role actually to increase regional importance for not just for European Union, but all other powers.
Yeah, thank you. So Um, Perhaps the point, I mean, summarizing point would be, if I turn to Muhammad, then that would be Central Asia has long been ignored by multiple international big players. But now, in the era of geopolitical rivalries, its vast energy resources, vast rare earth minerals, is turning it as a one space of attention of many. So, in this mind, how would you describe Central Asia's, I mean, as a one regional, as a bloc situation in the eyes of global international players? And most importantly, whether we could say that this is a bit of turning point for EU Central Asia relations because now we see an increased efforts by EU to bring Central Asian countries into closer partnership with the EU, which is anchored in the most recent summit held in Samarkand.
Yeah, definitely. I think the short answer about the unity, because we know that Central Asian region, if you may say, have been traditionally characterized as these countries could not come together, yeah, to leverage their regional position in their relations with vis-a-vis different power centers, be it China, Russia, or the United States. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and kind of a vacuum, yeah, it left in the Central Asian theater. We saw that Central Asian countries have been taking significant steps toward having unified position on different aspects of international affairs, again, in their relations with. Um, I remember just immediately after February 2022, there were C5+1 meetings with, again, China, Russia, United States, and EU. And there were different official visits, high-level visits from European Union, be it on the Commission level. Yeah, in 2022 there was Astana summit, and in 2023 there was summit in Cholpon-Ata, and Macron visited Central Asia. Then Central Asian leaders met Scholz, yeah, German chancellor, in Berlin, and they even met Biden in Washington, D.C. So it all showed that these countries not only increase their geopolitical significance, but they also come together, to position their. So I would call it this like permissive environment. Again, before there was kind of a Russian hegemony, and some people were calling it some gentleman agreement, yeah, between Russia and China, that Russia was dominant on military and security affairs, and China was expanding its economic footprint, yeah, in coordination with Russia, of course. So, but after 2022, we saw that let's say Central Asian countries' margin of error vis-a-vis both China and Russia expanded. And it increased their, let's say, maneuvering space in their international relations. So I think what we can call their foreign policy since then is strategic hedging, because right now they can cooperate closely with almost all different power centers without incurring, let's say, punishment. Yeah, they can go a deeper cooperation with China, the EU, United States without, like, it's not a zero-sum game anymore. So I don't know how long it will continue, because it was a kind of a window of opportunity, and seemingly since Trump's normalization efforts with Putin, and maybe that window may be closing soon. I don't know. It's difficult to say for now, but yeah. But when it comes to the EU, from specifically EU's point of view, it's all about strategic autonomy efforts. Yeah, it started well before, but after 2022, Mr. Borrell, their former, let's say, foreign minister, said EU's strategic autonomy from the United States on security affairs, because it's highly dependent on the United States for its security. It's seeking strategic autonomy from Russia on energy issues. Yeah, after 2022, we saw weaponization of gas and oil sales. And then we see strategic autonomy from China. They call it in Brussels the risking, yeah, policy. And in the issue of trade and let's say investments. So in that regard, Central Asia gains significance on two major issues. One is, again, in the case of Russia, that's connectivity, access to China. Yunus talked about the middle corridor. And another one is gas and oil. As you know, Kazakhstan is the third largest oil supplier of the EU. And after 2022, February, its, let's say, significance grew. I remember Tokayev in the early days said, okay, we will help the EU to let's say, overcome this energy uncertainty after this invasion. But immediately after that, Russians started to create problems for Kazakh oil exports through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium pipeline. So, and most importantly, the critical raw materials. Again, the Europeans see that China can very easily weaponize dependence, because it's not only about extraction. Yes, China extracts most of those lithium, cobalt, and graphite that are critical for two critical industries. One is military. Again, in the case of Ukraine war, you have to upgrade your military industrial complex, and you need critical raw materials. And the other one is green transition. Those minerals are essential for wind turbines, solar panels, and electric car batteries. And in that regard, the EU, and most importantly, it's all about processing. China is accounting for about more than 80% of processing capabilities of those critical raw materials. Now, the EU is trying to trying to see Central Asia as its broader efforts. Again, there is Latin America, there is Lithium Triangle. They are trying to establish new, let's say, ties with those countries and critical raw material partnerships. And Africa, EU is building this Libido corridor, and with Australia and Japan, they are deepening the partnerships again. And in both critical raw materials and energy, they are trying to diversify their dependence away from Russia and China. So in that regard, Central Asia becomes, let's say, very essential component of EU's global strategy in this last 3 years. So I can call it a turning point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. Very interesting. We will come back to this Central Asian type of regional integration at the very end, as in to discuss in a wider Eurasian space. But what I'm hearing a lot from my Central Asian colleagues is that there is definitely a factor of hedging. So there is definitely of everybody getting interested in Central Asia, having this 5+1 summits, either with the presence of US, China, EU, France, Germany, perhaps even Turkey, and also to the degree Russia. But when it comes to the two areas that Central Asian states are most concerned, the first is security, the second is investments to realize those meta large projects of connectivity, rare earth minerals, energy. Perhaps few are left in the room that are practically capable of extending their helping hand into Central Asian countries. So there is a lot of talk about Turkey, India, EU, Russia, Germany, China, France, US, perhaps even others, like let's say perhaps the middle-sized countries like Hungary and others too, Italy too. But the question is who is the real uh, actor, partner for Central Asian Five in areas that they concern more than any other areas? Is it China still in terms of security and in terms of delivering those economic benefits, or EU could be still a predictable partner for Central Asian Five? Yunus, you want to start on that when we'll continue with Mohammed?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for this question. So, in the current situation, from my point of view, still Russia and China are the main partner for the Central Asian countries, because there are a range of reasons. Russia has a still military base in Central Asia. Russian language is still lingua franca in the region. Russia is still main security provider. The terrorism or Islamic radicalism related issues in the region. In terms of China, play a role as a public service provider. Actually, in past we talk about mainly China on its investment on energy and infrastructure, traditional energy investment and infrastructure investment. However, we saw that it's also start to change in China. Not only invest traditional energy resource, but also invest renewable energy, electric vehicle sector, and critical minerals in Central Asia. In addition to that, it's not only about investment. The Central Asian countries also see China as a main technology provider in the particularly green technology related topics. So we saw that it's not only economic, but also growing technological power in Central Asia. And when we look the other partners, yes, they have a declaration, they have an interest, particularly United States and European Union. But when we looked at which partner actually transformed their declaration as an action, we saw that China still play important role in Central Asia rather than European Union and United States. Particularly, in addition to that, most important things, China's involvement in Central Asia not only limited green technology, traditional energy resource, but wide range, digitalization, agriculture, industrialization related topic. And also China not only deliver or try to extract raw materials from Central Asia's growing interest going through to processing, which is very important for Central Asian countries. This means that China also create value addition, at least in the initial stage for these countries. However, currently we saw that European Union tried to also give same promises or similar promises that yes, we don't want only to extract resource, for example, critical minerals. We also want the processing. Yes, that's a good promise, but when we look generally European Union approach, as Mr. Mehmet mentioned it, actually the bureaucracy and internal division in the European Union itself create challenges. So from my point of view, that the summit is a tentative and good step for the start. But the main question is actually in the long term, what will happen, whether they transfer the investment, whether they are or not. But currently, from my point of view, China and Russia still dominate. And most importantly, when we talk about the Central Asia, we also need to remember that yes, there is a great power competition. Yes, there is maybe again great game, but Central Asian countries has own strong negotiating power, and we saw that the countries try to use opportunity, negotiate more and extract more benefits, not only from China, from Russia, but also the European Union. I think that this is also a very important point.
So, Mohammed, then how this could be a turning point for EU Central Asia relations, given EU is neither capable of delivering what Russia delivers in terms of security arrangements, and nor capable of delivering what China is delivering in the form of, as Yunus mentioned, in the form of technological and economic investor. So, what is this EU Central Asia cooperation is about then? Is it about facade, or so what is the inside of this cooperation?
Again, it's too early to say that. I used turning point in the sense that really there are now, for example, if we talk about a middle corridor, yes, Traseka was always there, yeah, since the early 1990s, but we have not seen so far any significant EU commitment to financial commitment, yeah, to improve the hard and soft infrastructure of the corridor. It was mostly Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, and in some part Turkey. Investing and getting money, putting money into the projects and improving. Neither China was involved. So in that regard, I would say that this is a significant turning point, that these power centers are openly committed. Again, whether that will be sustainable. Right now, Northern Road through Russia is very operational. It's almost back to its pre-war levels. Yeah, I would say that's significant development. And so in that, when we talk about the middle corridor, we should keep that in mind. For example, when the Houthis started to attack the Red Sea shipping, the cargo didn't move back to the middle corridor. It moved back to the northern corridor because there are still significant bottlenecks. Again, what I mean by EU's turning point in EU, Central Asia, even South Caucasus and middle corridor is now Brussels is taking like credible steps to commit. Again, whether those projects will be realized, I don't know. We have this 10 billion euro allocation of commission in January 2024, and then now we have 12 billion. 3 billion of that is eyed for transport. Again, whether those projects will be realized, we'll see. Because again, EU is now in defensive, reactive mode. Yeah, it's High energy prices is putting pressure on its economies. We have demographic decline, and we have deindustrialization, especially in Germany. Yeah, it's a machine. And most importantly, there is division between the EU and the United States. It was mostly when it comes to Central Asia, it was also about security. Yeah, the threats from Afghanistan, and the United States was a key actor. Now, after 2021, we have totally different picture, and so that's why, taking all that into account, we have a kind of a mixed picture. That's difficult to say whether it will be sustainable. But when it comes to your question that we have all those C5+1 summits, I mean, so what? I think so far only China has taken steps to institutionalize, because you have to institutionalize to show your long-term commitment. And yeah, in the recent foreign affairs, I think foreign ministers summit, they established a secretariat for this platform that shows that China has long-term commitment and they are seriously invested in this project. In the case of the EU, we don't have. What I can say from the recent strategic partnership agreement they signed on April 4, um, uh, there it shows again the political relations will deepen, but also there was this new agreement signing being planned to sign with Central Asian countries. As you know, in 2015, they signed this enhanced partnership cooperation agreement with Kazakhstan, which came into force in 2020. But now, last year, 2024, they signed the same agreement with Kyrgyzstan. And this year they are planning to sign with Uzbekistan, and next year it will be signed with Tajikistan. And taking into account that Kaya Kallas was in Baku a few days ago, and there was this agreement, I think, at least on word, this expectation that the new strategic partnership agreement will be signed with Azerbaijan. It shows some kind of EU vision, yeah, that toward Eastern, as the fate of the Eastern Partnership program on the question. So it shows some kind of, strategy that they are trying to adapt to the new uncertainty in the region. But again, what I liked about the summit also was that there was some plans what they will do next year, for example. Yeah, in 2025, this year, we have two planned summits again in Uzbekistan. One is Trans-Caspian Transport Corridor, this investment forum, yeah, and similar to the one in 2024 January. And there will be this EU Central Asia Economic Forum, again in Uzbekistan, Samarkand, I think. So it shows that, yes, we have this summit, and we have some in the short term, again, new plans to convene and act according to some roadmap. But again, institutionalization of this partnership is right now most effective in the case of China, and EU, I think, has still some way to go to show its serious commitment to this partnership.
Thank you. Before I turn to the next question, I want to also mention that so we have participants in this webinar, and so there is a possibility of you asking the question towards the end of the webinar, which will happen in 30 minutes from now on. So please feel free to type down your questions or comments if you have in the chat section, which I will be reading and addressing to our speakers. Turning to the next question. So, EU is reactionary, as you said. It is trying to be assertive because it is in crisis to a certain degree. It needs this assertiveness. Some people in Central Asia are arguing that to make this reactionary position a sustainable engagement, there is a way, and that is the middle corridor, as in to get the more European attention for a possible new linchpin of international trade that would connect EU with China and vice versa. But on the other hand, the problem is, as you hinted, middle corridor is seen as an alternative to alternative. So the EU-China trade is happening globally through the maritime routes, which is nowadays is a bit of a problem because of the Houthis. The alternative to this maritime route was a Russia road, which is a bit of the problems of international sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine. And here comes a third third option, which is own problems and also advantages. So in the to oppose on Central Asian interests to increase their agency by making a middle corridor as an international linchpin of trade. On the other hand, international trade dynamics that say that this trade should either by maritime routes or Russia for Central Asia.
Corridor actually is the most operational route currently for the China and European Union land-based trade. However, from my point of view, the main lesson that European Union and also I would say the same similar things for the China, the main lesson that they took from the last 3 years, dependence on maritime route is risky because of, as you mentioned, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, or also I think that the COVID crisis also shows that how the different external shocks affect the maritime routes. And second lesson, I think that absolutely show both China and European Union that dependence on one land-based route is also risky. I mean the Northern Corridor, because in this context we saw that why Middle Corridor is important. Of course, Middle Corridor can't replace Northern Corridor, can't replace maritime route, but it can be good options for making at least compensate some loss of the international companies from European Union or China, and also offer the alternative. But I mean alternative not for the replacement, but at least in the external shock for switching. And as you mentioned, there's a middle corridor has a lot of different the challenges in terms of limited port capacity, lack of fleet in the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Also, still need to develop the hard infrastructure, particularly the railway in the both Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Georgia, and particularly also Turkey need to invest more and develop it. But the most important thing is here, the diversification policy, from my point of view, the major interest that actually increase the middle corridor strategic importance. When we look at this point or at this the perspective, we show that why China and European Union start to increase their interest on the middle corridor for the international trade. And the second most important things, in addition to land-based trade between China and European Union, from my point of view, middle corridor also important for deepening relationship with South Caucasus and Central Asia when we look the European Union, because it create new export and import routes for the European Union, and it also reduce dependence on Russia. And most importantly, it can create new leverage, at least, let's say not absolutely, but relatively new leverage for European Union when they negotiate with Russia, because alternatives is always important. But when we look before the war, Russia-Ukraine war, we saw that European Union as a almost absolute dependence on energy import, also transit issues. So when we look in the context of diversification policy, and also finding new partners through the middle corridor and deepening relationship, I think that middle corridor makes sense that why it's important internationally, at least in the long term.
Very important points, Eunice, which I want to use and to ask a question to Mohammed. You said that the one of the ways to get it more EU attention is that to present a middle corridor, if I get it correctly, as an alternative to Russian route in a way that it is part of a wider EU-Russia negotiations, so increase the upper hand of EU in terms of its maneuvering capacities. Then I'm tying it up with Mohammed's point that EU is reactionary because of the war in Ukraine. So if we combine these two, then we get a picture in which EU support to middle corridor is contingent upon continuation of war in Ukraine, meaning effectively when the war in Ukraine ends in one way or another, we will be having a completely different EU that will be not interested in a way that it is interested now in investing and supporting Central Asian countries. The question is then the ball in whose court? Is it the Central Asian responsibility to complete this connectivity routes, or should they or can they rely on EU in the case of hypothetically post-war Ukraine space in Europe? This is to you, Mohammed, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, first of all, Northern Route, Russian Railways, Trans-Siberian Railway is not still sanctioned. Yeah. There is a still ongoing war. There are many sanctions, but Russian railways are not sanctioned. And even in November 2024, we saw that Russians themselves were keeping the cargo stuck in Russian railways that were en route to European Union because of their dual use nature. Yeah? So, and some people after that started to argue that, okay, that's the end. I mean, because Chinese side were expected to put pressure on the Russians to let the cargo move on. But still, I think so far that problem has been solved. But transport is all about certainty, and the Russia-Ukraine war created, I think, quite a lot of uncertainty. And when we see Russia, not with the EU, but Russia-US normalization, which created some sort of sense that the EU and China can find new, let's say, avenues for cooperation. So that in that regard, I think China is this time we can say that is highly interested in finding alternative routes that is not under Russian or the US control. Again, I'm using the US in the case of Malacca Strait, I mean, maritime routes. And if we can argue that the US pivot is finally underway, I mean, at least Trump is saying so, that he's ending wars in Europe and the Middle East so that he can focus more, easily in Asia Pacific, where China is. So that may increase the prospects of tensions along the Taiwan Strait and its possible closure. Yeah. So that increases the strategic importance of land corridors, as Eunice said, that will link China with the EU, and at the same time, the economies on the way of the route. Yeah, that's very essential because these countries are resource-rich countries, some of them. So yeah, in that regard, I think again, EU, China, maybe some kind of normalization, because as you know, after 2021, they did not sign this comprehensive investment agreement, yeah, KAI. And now there is some warming of ties. There will be summit in July, I think, in Beijing. It was supposed to be in Brussels, but now they are going to Beijing. And I think there are many arguments, people speculating that Trump has been quite successful in pushing EU towards Chinese arms. Okay, it will not be. I don't think it will be long-term like amity, but at least in the short term, I'm sure that European countries are especially some member states like Spain, pushing hard to let's say deepen ties. So in that regard, where is the middle corridor? I think in the case of EU Central Asia relations, its middle corridor is mostly about resilience. Yes, it's maybe a little outdated now because EU adopted its latest global strategy, security strategy in 2016, and there, with regard to neighborhood countries, they use the term resilience. That means they're especially economic resilience. And in the case of the middle corridor, can serve to bolster economic resilience of Central Asian countries vis-a-vis Russia and China, because these countries are highly dependent on neighboring countries. So in that regard, a middle corridor, when we look at the strategy documents, for example, EBRD document, yeah, they have a report in summer 2023. It talks about the connectivity in Central Asia. It doesn't even mention South Caucasus. You don't see South Caucasus there. It's another weak point. I think we can discuss in detail. I mean, separately, because Turkey and Georgia, Azerbaijan, I mean, even Armenia in general, are essential for EU access, but somehow they are not given due attention in EU's, let's say, discussions with the Central Asian leaders. So, yeah, in that regard, middle corridor is about deepening connectivity and transport links between the Central Asian countries themselves so that they can deepen trade and political ties between themselves and bolster their resilience against, let's say, negative external involvement. That's Russia and China. And the other one is their integration into global value and supply chains. Again, this is also about resilience. These countries are landlocked. Uzbekistan is even dead, I think double landlocked. Yeah. So, and these countries need investments in their local industries. Again, Yunis talked about it. Not only about resource extraction and green energy and all this stuff, fancy words, but you need tangible investments in their processing capabilities that so that these countries have value-added economies. Yeah. And for example, in the case of the EU, there is another issue, this CBAM, yeah, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That, for example, Kazakhstan is sending. I mean, EU Central Asia trade is 80% about EU Kazakhstan, yeah, Kazakhstan's oil exports, and in the near future, EU is planning to include oil into CBAM requirements. So, what will happen to Kazakhstan? So, you have to help these countries to decarbonize their fossil fuel economy. I mean, mostly dependent on fossil fuels. So, how you do that? For example, I don't know, again, maybe I'm going a bit far, but there was this discussion, I mean, in Memorandum of Understanding with Kazakhstan signed immediately after the war in Ukraine in 2022 about green hydrogen. But unfortunately, in this document, I didn't see any. In the annexes, it was mentioned, but it was not talked about like CRMs. So green hydrogen is about helping Kazakhstan not only establish like export mechanism to send its green hydrogen to the EU, but also use its green hydrogen locally to decarbonize its fossil fuel extraction. It's very important. So in that regard, it would highly strengthen Kazakhstan export potential. Again, so I see Middle Corridor not only last point as a like container transportation route, but also like in the India Middle East corridor. Yeah, what's it about? Not only about cargo container transportation, but also green energy. You send um, electricity and critical raw materials, hydrogen, digital connectivity, oil and gas, and everything. I mean, it should be a full-fledged economic corridor, not only like transit route, but full-fledged economic corridor. So that how the EU can help here, it's mostly about soft infrastructure. EU is what we call it in international relations, Brussels effect. Yeah, EU is exporting its regulatory apparatus to the neighborhood countries so that they can be integrated into the EU mechanism. So EU can help with that regard. So we have Team Europe initiatives in Central Asian countries. The expectation is that they can somehow lift these countries, like the technical and regulatory capabilities to better, let's say, bring them toward the EU, let's say, economy, rather than just a transit between the EU and China.
Okay. Yeah, Kazakhstan is, I think, still affected by the CBAM to a certain degree because of this applies also to metals, which Kazakhstan is exporting to the EU. So they're forced to pay more just to just
Fertilizers mostly.
yeah, fertilizers, chemicals, petrochemicals, and also not mistaking hydrogen to a certain degree, though not for all and good for so far, but there are discussions as you mentioned. Then, I mean, coming back to the first point that we discussed, I mean, so Central Asia is having a degree of regional cooperation that is quite interesting case study. In opposition to the Baltic 3, there is no supernatural structures that help them to integrate regionally. So perhaps, if, I'm not sure if you would agree with me, but there is very little integration between Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan in economic sense within the Central Asian space. But especially after the war in Ukraine, we have seen an increased regional efforts to become a unified voice, which manifests itself as different forms and shape. And also one of the most, let's say, remarkable result is also this border agreement between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, in which they decided to settle down their border dispute. So there is a sort of a regionalization brewing in Central Asia. But at the same time, what I got from your insight is that Russia needs to be replaced economically and security-wise. China is willing to act and actually doing a lot in terms of economy, but not willing to act security-wise. EU is a reactionary actor. There is a lot of good words, but when it comes to substance, there's very few actions. And in the long run, the question is whether EU will remain engaged in the same way that it is now, given there is a possibility of Ukraine war ending in a unfavorable terms to the EU and transatlantic cooperation, possible rift between the US, and also possible escalation between the US and China, which would put also Central Asia under very tight radar. So all in this all reminds us the one thing is what is the future for Central Asian Five? What is the perspectives for their regionalization efforts? Is it possible to Central Asia to become a bit of unified bloc, or is it too small and too resource poor to emerge as a possible regional bloc of countries? If it needs to be expanded, which is the direction for its possible expansion? Should it be a bloc of a peripheral bloc for enlarged Chinese presence, or should it be a regional bloc that would also could encompass Caucasian and also Caucasian countries and also Turkey? So what is your take on this? As in, what is the future for Central Asian regionalization in light of all these um bad geopolitics happening around? Eunice, yeah.
So, um, thank you very much for this question. In terms of regionalization, I think that there is a future, but it will be more about economic oriented rather than the politically the integration. But we need to first look the tendency when we look at when the Central Asian countries start to cooperate each other and their relationships start to develop. I will say it start since 2016 when in Uzbekistan particularly Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power because in comparison with the past president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev has a much more cooperative policy. And we saw that he's quickly developed relationship with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. He's also tried to solve most important issue, the water issue between the countries that actually can create even crisis. As you know, in the past, there's a even war probability between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan for the water issues. But we saw that Uzbekistan tried to solve these problems. I think that currently the Uzbekistan lead in terms of regional diplomacy, and Kazakhstan follow it. So, in addition to that, another important point is the security problem. As you know, Central Asian countries has border issues among each other, particularly Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. As we saw again, Uzbekistan lead and solve the most of the border issues. Then recently, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan signed historical agreement. From my point of view, when we talk about integration, this is very important. As currently we saw, amid the global geopolitical turbulence, in the lot of problems in Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, China, United States, but in the Central Asia, we saw that more peaceful environment rather than new crisis, new instability. We saw that these countries try to solve the border issues and try to act together, or at least create a relatively peaceful environment. From my point of view, currently there are a lot of opportunities, and in terms of integration or regionalization, as you mentioned, from my point of view, there's a possibility that in the long term, not in the short term, if these countries start to develop their trade relations with each other, because in past their trade relations with each other is also very limited, and they're more related to Russia, Central Asia trade relations, China, Central Asia, not each other. But currently, if they start to develop their trade relations and increase also trade volume. In addition to that, if this peaceful environment continue, there's a strong possibility that there's some regionalization effort similar to Southeast Asian countries rather than European Union, because my own observation shows that Central Asian countries is very defensive against the political integration, because as we see in Russia initiative, they always react and resist in terms of Eurasian Economic Union, for example, or the Commonwealth. And in this context, I think that economic integration or economic regionalization can be the priority. but there's some challenges. Again, is the limited trade, limited investment to each other, and also they need to develop the interregional infrastructures. So again, we saw that Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan take initiative. They strengthen their connectivity between each other, not only for the being transit region. So that's, from my point of view, that 3 point will be very important. And if they have economic regionalization, it can create a huge power, at least when they negotiate against China, Russia, and European Union. And I think that it's already effective when we see that these countries started to create new negotiation channel or communication channel with China, and they act collectively, and China accommodated. For example, as I noted, for when we look particularly new investment, investment to value added sector, we saw that China accommodated. So if they continue to cooperate and transform this cooperation as the economic regionalization, I think that there is a huge perspective. And in that case, the region will not be the periphery, I think, itself. It will be the center, and it will be the huge negotiation power to create a new dialogue with China, European Union, United States, Russia, and also for the Turkey and Gulf countries.
Thank you. Mohammed, also the same question to you. If 5 minutes would be very great.
Yeah, that definitely, Eunice provide very good insights, but I would just add some comments that, okay, if you talk about a Baltic style kind of cooperation or integration, it's close to impossible because it's different contexts. I mean, theoretically, you need a common enemy, yeah, especially to bring together these as divergent as interests of these countries have, yeah. So it's very difficult. For example, Kazakhstan and let's say Kyrgyzstan are part of Eurasian Economic Union, and let's say these countries are, for example, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan are not part of Turkic organization, Turkic state. I mean, these countries are separated and let's say are part of member of different organizations, and just to establish regionalization and bring them together on political and security, not even mentioning economic platforms, you also need a security anchor. I mean, okay, again, it's theoretical, but how the EU became successful was mostly dependent on the United States security guarantees, yeah, after the Second World War. And the same with Baltics. I mean, the United States factor was significant, but in the case of Central Asia, we do not have that. I mean, simply no common enemy, no security anchor, different great powers invested in the region, zero-sum games. Some people call it a new great game 2-0. And okay, that's overestimation a bit, but still some reality points there. So when it comes to economic integration, even that is difficult because the domestic political nature, yeah, nature of political systems in these countries, political economic, let's call them neo-patrimonial, yeah, because for economic cooperation integration you need some reforms. I mean, some opening and some concessions, which will be difficult in the case of these countries like Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. And there is also internal competition between the regional countries. I mean, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, I'm sure, I mean, would be on each other's neck for leadership. Even we see sometimes in the summits who will speak first and second, and that's, I think, quite a big bottleneck too. They're competing. Even when it comes to regional connectivity projects, we see that Uzbekistan is doing its best to avoid dependence on Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is doing the same with Turkmenistan and others. So it's again, it's that they have some marriage of convenience, but difficult to say something kind of sustainable, let's say, regional projects to come forward in the near future. Again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was kind of in a window of opportunity, but again, we'll see. Yeah, I think that's my basically my comments on that.
Thank you so much. It was very informative. I mean, I would have loved to continue this conversation for hours, especially to discuss whether this window of opportunity is closing. If yes, then what is the post-window opportunity for Central Asia could look like, practically speaking. But unfortunately, we have a time limits. So I'm very thankful to both of you for attending and giving very important insights into Central Asia and its intersection with the global powers. But we have also a question and comments. Um, so we have a comment from Nurana Muradova who says that there are challenges even in terms of container transportation, which is a minor aspect of a transportation. So transport companies face challenge in improving it as well, which prevents them choosing middle corridors as an option. I think that was a general comment. But we have Murad's question about Turkmenistan. So recently there was an unusual exchange of friendly rhetoric between EU and Turkmenistan. Do you think, I think this question is to both of you, EU and Turkmenistan, Europe will be able to finally persuade Ashgabat to agree on exporting its gas reserves to westwards? I think, Mohammed, we could start with you if you don't mind, then Yunus, I'll also ask your opinion on that.
I mean, about gas, it's not. I mean, it's the same problem we have with Azerbaijan. I mean, the EU does not have long-term gas, let's say, a commitment. I mean, President Aliyev also openly said many times that okay, if I mean, let's say EBRD and the European Investment Bank do not issue loans for investments in those projects because of this green transition, and that's it. So the point is that how I mean, would EU commit itself financially for the extraction of those resources in Turkmenistan and for pipeline? Who will build the pipeline? Yeah. So again, I'm not even talking about Russian and Iranian concerns, like environmental concerns. They will definitely be against. Yes, now Russia and Iran are preparing to build lay pipeline under the Caspian Sea and through Azerbaijan. We'll see, but still, it's a very quite political issue, and I'm sure that there will be pressure on that side. And when it comes to, again, two main questions are who will pay for that extraction and who will pay for the pipeline. And I don't see any signal from the European side that they are interested in that. It's just used, I think, political rhetoric to engage Turkmenistan somehow because there are not many points Turkmenistan can be engaged. So they are keeping them on around the table. And again, it's positive for broader EU Central Asia relations. But specifically on the gas, again, Turkmenistan is also trying to maneuver with China about the prices. Again, they are selling to Azerbaijan. Now there is this deal through Iran to Turkey. They are selling some gas. That's, I think, just maneuvering to negotiate better deals with maybe Chinese side because that's the main export market. And again, when it comes to the EU, it's all about how the EU's this green strategy will be modified. I'm saying modified because after Trump, there is a big pressure on this Inflation Reduction Act. As you know, it was the main driver of the green transition in the United States. He just returned it back. So I'm sure that it will affect the green transition process in the EU. There will be pressure. I don't know how they will decide. So yeah, in that regard, they will have I mean, big difficulty in answering the questions I put about the investments and the
Okay.
commitment.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yunus, Mohammed mentioned, I mean, talked largely about a European perspective, as in there's lack of commitment on the European side. But what about the Turkmen side? How how engaged they are in terms of their willingness to go westward? Because they do eastward, but what about the west?
So I always try to divide when I look at Central Asian countries, there's three different let's say categories. The first is the proactive one, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Second, the reactive one, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and third one is the neutral one, or the mainly is the Turkmenistan. But I mean, neutral here is not a long-term strategy and mostly focus on a tactical movement. From my point of view, when we looked at this the project, I think that Turkmenistan mostly try to use this as a the tool for the negotiate with the other countries, not only China but also for the Russia. So in terms of the project, I completely agree with Mr. Mohammed because the feasibility studies and finance will face huge resistance because these days European Union-led institution doesn't actually very reluctant to finance fossil fuels related to infrastructure, and in addition that it requires huge investment. And I think that even the Turkmenistan try to negotiate it, I don't think that there will be investment, large-scale investment for realization of this project. And second and most important thing, even Turkmenistan want to diversify its export routes, not only for the European Union, but also through the Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. The major problem, when we look particularly the westward, the gas project, there is also a resistance from the regional powers called Russia and Iran. So that's also another point, that whether they will lead to the realization of project. And finally, most importantly, Turkmenistan foreign policy, from my point of view, even now, not based on long-term strategy. It's mostly based on tactical movements. So when we look at this, we saw that last 10 years, there is always the trend topic in Turkmenistan portfolio. The first about this gas project, another the project is the TAPI, the project, the gas pipeline toward India. And when they emerged, there's either crisis in the geopolitical crisis, or there's the weak relationship with China or Russia. So that's why I think that even the Turkmenistan want that first European Union hasn't got actually the willingness to finance. The second, I think that Turkmenistan has on itself hasn't got long-term strategy for this project, and it's tried to use as a tool. And from my point of view, even the current geopolitical situation, this project is not feasible. And I think that it will be again, we are in the same paradox again. It will be emerged and will go on probably again.
Yeah, thank you. So last question is from Ilkin Guliyev, who says that, I mean, to summarize, the question is, Kazakhstan is the leading figure in terms of economy, and it is enjoying benefits with Russia because of its Eurasian Economic Union partnership, membership, sorry. But there is very little internal trade between Central Asian countries. So long story short, the what are they supposed to import export from each other? If we're speaking of, let's say, regionalization, if we're speaking of increasing intergovernmental ties, then the question is what they are supposed to do in terms of exporting, importing from each other. Yunus, you want to start first, then we could go to Mohammed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as I mentioned before, since we saw that more cooperative diplomacy from Uzbekistan, we saw that there is also growing at least relatively growing trade relationship with between Central Asian countries, and also investment. I think that they are currently focused on more the hydropower project, because, as I mentioned, they try to solve the water issues. And currently, Uzbekistan, for example, support the Rogan Dam. Also, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan support Kambarata, the hydropower, the project in Kyrgyzstan, and they try to create mutual beneficial the condition for the electricity trade. So this is also very important for the regional. I think that it can be one of the driving of the regionalization effort, because, as you know, in the during the Soviet Union there is a unified electricity system, but when they declare their independence, this system start to broke apart, and currently they start to negotiate and they try to continue for the electricity export. I think that this can also the important component of the current trend. The second, actually, these countries all eager to export more or less the same product to other regional powers. But in terms of the trade, I think that agricultural cooperation can be important, because Kazakhstan is the leading country, and I think that the climate change actually less affect currently in Kazakhstan, and agricultural cooperation can be the most important tool for increase the interregional the trade relations. In addition to that, yes, maybe it's not in the long term also traditional energy resource, because we saw that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan look each other to exchange or import. Uzbekistan, for example, particularly import more gas because there is a gas shortage and the energy insecurity. I think that if they have a chance to exchange their own traditional energy resource to each other, it can also contribute to trade cooperation. However, that's also great limitation, because, as I noted before, these countries all try to export more or less the same good. This also can create the regional competition. So in the long term, it will be very important that whether these countries compensate each other, cooperate, or again choose the competition to export or for the same market. And I think that in the current situation shows that they are still in the cooperation line rather than competition. But that's a long game.
Okay, thank you. Mehmet, you want to have a short one on this?
Yeah, Yunus thoroughly commented on that. But yeah, I'll just say, yeah, definitely I agree with that. The point that Russia is the main market and driving force behind that the integration, if we may call it, processes before. But now, I think one of the challenge would be that, in kind of if these countries are opening to each other, there will be concerns of asymmetry. Again, because Kazakhstan dominates, I think, in many components of trade and even being part of the Eurasian Economic Union, we have seen many examples that, for example, Kazakhstan closed its borders for Kyrgyz trucks and let's say sometimes people tell it as an advantage, but that's not, I think, many times the case. And Uzbekistan happened this potato wars and others. So the point is that I mean, some kind of a mechanism of trust should be established so that this economic interdependence should not be construed as let's say extending dependence on Russia, let's say, to Kazakhstan. So I think I mean it should not be about only economy, but a comprehensive partnership that also on political realms they create this platform of trust that they can trade effectively. So in that regard, I would just conclude with the point that this integration into global value and supply chains is also essential. For example, if China's engagement with the region could focus on one issue area in one country and another component, let's say, extraction in one country, processing in another, and so these countries can find some mechanism let's say to let's say leverage their comparative advantage on different trade sectors that can push the trade cooperation forward. But currently, again, I think another bottleneck is transport. Again, these big cities are very far from each other, even sometimes inside the same country, like let's say Kazakhstan. And so transport, in this regard, EU's initiatives are very, I think, welcoming that. If this, I mean, if you decrease the price of transport, that would highly contribute to the boosting trade between these countries, I mean, intra-regionally. So yeah, in that regard, there is potential, but again, that will take a lot of time and energy, and most importantly, political commitment and will from these countries.
Got it. Thank you so much, both of you, and also the audience. I want to thank the audience for attending, for asking the questions, writing commentary, and listening. It's highly appreciated. And Eunice and Mohammed, I'm very thankful to both of you. I really enjoyed this webinar, learned a lot, and I hope you found this useful. And again, thanks very much. We will be again, hopefully, meeting again in webinar or in different forms. Have a nice day, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.